The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon as Bridget Mason clutched her two hungry children close, their hollow eyes staring up at the meager pile of potato peelings and stale bread crusts she'd managed to scavenge from behind the general store in Dry Creek, Arizona Territory. 1883. Her trembling fingers divided the pitiful meal 3 ways when a shadow fell across the abandoned barn they'd been calling home for the past week. "Ma, someone's here," 7-year-old Tommy whispered, fear threading through his voice as little Emma, barely 5, buried her face in the folds of Bridget's tattered skirt. The silhouette of a tall man filled the doorway, his broad shoulders and the distinctive shape of a Stetson marking him unmistakably as one of the local ranchers. Bridget instinctively moved in front of her children, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is private property, madam," the man said, his voice deep but not unkind. He stepped forward into the fading light, revealing a weathered face, perhaps 30 years old, with piercing blue eyes that took in the scene before him with a flash of something that looked like recognition. "Please," Bridget began, her voice cracking, "just one more night, we'll be gone by morning." The stranger's gaze moved from Bridget's face to the children cowering behind her, then to the pitiful scraps arranged on a piece of burlap between them. His jaw tightened. "Not in my house," he said firmly, causing Bridget to flinch. But then he added, "Not again. No one feeds their children scraps in my house." Bridget blinked in confusion as the man removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with Tommy, who peered cautiously from behind his mother's skirts. "My name's Vaughn Blackwood," he said, his voice gentler now. "This is my land and that there," he nodded toward a distant cluster of lights barely visible through the barn door, "is my ranch house. And I reckon it's supper time. Real supper time." Emma's small voice piped up. "What's real supper time, mister?" Vaughn's stern face softened just slightly. "Hot stew, fresh bread, maybe even some apple pie if Mrs. Ortiz was baking today." He stood, returning his hat to his head. "You folks are welcome to join me unless you prefer these accommodations." Bridget stiffened, years of hard-learned caution rising in her throat. "We don't take charity, mister." "Blackwood, it's not charity when it's a neighborly meal," Vaughn replied evenly. "And these little ones look like they could use some neighborly feeding." His eyes met Bridget's, and there was something in them, something that spoke of understanding beyond mere pity. Tommy tugged at his mother's skirt. "Please, Ma, I'm awful hungry." The admission pierced Bridget's heart like a knife. 3 years since James had died in that mining accident in Colorado, 3 years of drifting westward, taking laundry and mending work where she could find it, watching her children grow thinner while she grew more desperate. "Just a meal," Vaughn added quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Then I'll bring you back if that's what you want." Bridget looked down at Emma's hopeful face, then back to the stranger. Something about him seemed trustworthy, despite everything life had taught her about men and their false promises. Or perhaps it was simply that she had run out of options. "Just a meal," she agreed reluctantly. The walk to Vaughn Blackwood's ranch house took less than 15 minutes, but to Bridget, it felt like crossing a boundary she couldn't return from. Emma rode on Vaughn's shoulders after her tiny legs tired quickly, giggling despite her mother's disapproving glance. Tommy walked beside Bridget, occasionally looking up at her with uncertain eyes. "How'd you end up in my barn?" Vaughn asked as they walked. "The stagecoach left us in Dry Creek," Bridget explained tersely. "I was told there might be work at the Wilkerson place, but when we got there, they'd already hired someone." "Old man Wilkerson," Vaughn nodded. "His daughter came back from back east, probably what changed their plans." "I had enough for a night at the boarding house, but not 3, Bridget continued. "We've been managing on potato peelings," Vaughn observed without judgment. "You headed anywhere particular?" "California," Bridget answered. "I hear there's work in the fruit orchards." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "California's still a fair piece from here, madam, especially on foot with 2 young ones." The ranch house appeared before them, larger than Bridget had anticipated, a sturdy two-story structure with warm light spilling from the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. A few ranch hands crossed the yard, tipping their hats respectfully as Vaughn approached. "Boss," one called out, eyeing Bridget and the children with undisguised curiosity. "Evening, Pete," Vaughn replied easily. "Let Mrs. Ortiz know we have 3 more for supper." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, solid furniture, clean floors, and walls adorned with a few modest paintings. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair bustled out from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Senor Vaughn, I was wondering when," she stopped short, taking in the sight of Bridget and the children. Her expression softened immediately. "Ah, guests, the little ones look hungry. Come to the kitchen." Emma immediately gravitated toward the smiling woman, while Tommy remained close to Bridget, watching everything with wary eyes. "Mrs. Ortiz, this is—" Vaughn paused, looking at Bridget questioningly. "Bridget Mason," she supplied reluctantly. "And my children, Thomas and Emma." "The Masons will be joining us for dinner," Vaughn explained. "They've had a long journey." Mrs. Ortiz nodded, understanding passing between her and Vaughn that made Bridget wonder if this was a common occurrence, Vaughn Blackwood bringing strays home to his kitchen. The meal was unlike anything Bridget and her children had eaten in months, perhaps years. Rich beef stew with tender vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and sweet butter that made Emma's eyes widen in delight. Tommy ate with the focused intensity of a child who had known true hunger, while Bridget found herself struggling to maintain her composure in the face of such unexpected bounty. Vaughn ate quietly, occasionally answering a question from Tommy about the ranch or responding to Mrs. Ortiz's gentle prompting to take second helpings. He didn't press Bridget with questions, for which she was grateful. The respite from constant vigilance, if only for an hour, was almost as nourishing as the food. When the apple pie arrived, Emma actually clapped her hands, earning a smile from Vaughn that transformed his weathered face. "You have a beautiful home, Mr. Blackwood," Bridget said finally, feeling that some acknowledgement was necessary. "Built it myself," Vaughn replied. "Started with just the kitchen and 1 bedroom 15 years ago. Added on as the ranch grew." "You live here alone?" The question slipped out before Bridget could stop it, and she immediately regretted its impropriety. If Vaughn was offended, he didn't show it. "Just me and Mrs. Ortiz, who comes in during the day. The ranch hands have a bunkhouse out back." After dinner, Mrs. Ortiz insisted on showing Emma the chicken coop before darkness fell completely, and Tommy eagerly joined them, leaving Bridget alone with Vaughn on the porch. "I appreciate the meal," Bridget said stiffly, "but we really should be getting back to town. Perhaps there's work I haven't heard about yet." Vaughn leaned against the porch railing, studying her. "There isn't," he said bluntly. "Dry Creek's barely hanging on since the silver mine played out. Most folks are just getting by themselves." Bridget felt the familiar weight of desperation settling back onto her shoulders. "Then we'll move on tomorrow." "To where?" Vaughn asked. "Next town's 2 days hard ride, walking with children." He shook his head. "Longer." "We've managed before," Bridget said defensively. "I can see that," Vaughn replied, his voice softening. "But you don't have to anymore, at least not right away." Bridget tensed. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Blackwood?" "I need help around here," he said simply. "Mrs. Ortiz isn't getting any younger, and she's been after me to hire someone to help with the house. The room above the kitchen is empty. It's small, but it would fit the 3 of you." "I don't need charity," Bridget repeated, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's not charity when you work for it," Vaughn countered. "Fair wage, room and board. Stay until you've saved enough to make it to California proper if that's still where you want to go." "Why would you do this? You don't know me." Vaughn was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to where Emma was now chasing a chicken with delighted squeals, Tommy laughing despite himself. "I know what it's like to be hungry," he said finally. "And I know what it's like to have someone extend a hand when you need it most." He turned back to her. "You don't have to decide tonight. Stay, get some rest, think about it." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in weeks with her children sleeping peacefully beside her, Bridget stared at the ceiling and considered her options. They were few. The money she'd saved from her last job in Santa Fe was nearly gone. The children needed stability, food, warmth. And something about Vaughn Blackwood's straightforward offer felt genuine, untainted by the ulterior motives she'd come to expect from men's generosity. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would stay, but only until she'd saved enough to continue their journey. This was temporary, she reminded herself firmly. Just another stop on the way to California and the fresh start she'd promised her children after James died. Vaughn accepted her decision with a simple nod, as if he'd expected nothing else, and showed her around the ranch house, explaining her duties. The work was straightforward cooking, cleaning, mending, helping Mrs. Ortiz with the household management. The pay was more than fair, and for the first time in years, Bridget felt the tightness in her chest ease just slightly. The children adapted quickly, as children do. Emma became Mrs. Ortiz's shadow, learning Spanish words and helping to collect eggs from the henhouse. Tommy, after some initial hesitation, found himself drawn to the ranch's operations, watching the cowboys with undisguised fascination. "Your boys got a good eye," Vaughn commented one evening, a week after their arrival, as they watched Tommy helping one of the ranch hands mend a bridle. "He figured out that leather stitch faster than most grown men I've hired," pride warmed Bridget's chest. "His father was good with his hands. Tommy takes after him." Vaughn asked carefully. "James died in a mining accident in Colorado 3 years ago." The words came easier now than they once had, though the ache never truly left. Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm sorry." "We manage," Bridget said, the phrase a familiar refrain, though it felt different now, less desperate. "Yes," Vaughn agreed, his gaze lingering on her face a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I can see that you do." As the days turned to weeks, Bridget found herself settling into life at the Blackwood Ranch despite her determination to remain detached. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time since James's death, she felt a sense of security wrapping around her and her children like a warm blanket. Vaughn was a fair employer, respectful of her privacy, generous with provisions for the children, and surprisingly gentle in his occasional corrections when she made mistakes in the running of the household. She learned that he had built the ranch from nothing, arriving in Arizona territory 20 years earlier with little more than the clothes on his back and a determination to own land. "My father was a tenant farmer in Tennessee," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed, a new ritual that had developed without either of them quite acknowledging it. "Worked someone else's land his whole life, died owing money to the same family he was born owing. I swore I'd never live that way." "And now you own all this," Bridget observed, gesturing to the expanse of land visible in the moonlight. 5,000 acres, Vaughn nodded. "Though some would say it owns me." There was something in his voice, a loneliness perhaps, that resonated with Bridget's own private ache, but she pushed the thought away, reminding herself that her stay at the Blackwood Ranch was temporary. 3 months, she had decided. 3 months to save enough money to reach California with a cushion for establishing themselves. As August turned to September, and the worst of the summer heat began to relent, Bridget found herself watching Vaughn more carefully. The way he listened intently when Tommy described the constellations he'd learned from one of the ranch hands. The patience with which he answered Emma's endless questions. The respect he showed to every person who worked for him, from Mrs. Ortiz to the youngest stable boy. She caught herself wondering about his past, about why a man with so much to offer remained alone at 35. There had been hints in conversations with Mrs. Ortiz about a woman long ago, but the housekeeper was respectfully vague, and Bridget refused to pry. One evening in late September, a fierce thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Emma, terrified of the booming thunder, refused to sleep, clinging to Bridget with trembling hands. Unexpectedly, it was Vaughn who appeared at their door with a solution. My mother used to tell me stories during storms, he said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. Said the thunder was just the sky giants playing 9 pins and we shouldn't be afraid of their game. Emma peered at him from beneath the blanket. What's 9 pins? It's a game with balls and pins, Vaughn explained. When they knock them down, that's the big boom we hear. But it's scary, Emma insisted. Tell you what, Vaughn suggested. How about I tell you a story about the bravest little girl I ever knew, who wasn't afraid of sky giants or anything else? Emma nodded eagerly, and Tommy, pretending he wasn't interested but clearly listening, edged closer on the bed. Vaughn launched into a tale about a girl named Ella who befriended a thundercloud and convinced it to rain only at night when the crops needed water, but children were safely tucked in bed. His voice, usually so matter-of-fact, took on a gentler cadence as he spun the story, complete with different voices for each character. Bridget watched from the doorway, something unfamiliar and warm unfurling in her chest. By the time Vaughn finished his tale, Emma was heavy-lidded with sleep, the thunder forgotten. Tommy, too, had drifted off, his small hand clutching the edge of Vaughn's sleeve. "You're good with them," Bridget said softly as Vaughn carefully extricated himself and joined her at the door. "They're good children," Vaughn replied simply. "You've done well by them, Mrs. Mason." "Bridget," she said impulsively. "Please call me Bridget." Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "Bridget," he agreed, her name sounding different somehow in his deep voice. "Good night." "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, testing the shape of his name on her lips, and finding she liked it perhaps more than she should. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the bustle of preparations for winter. Bridget found herself increasingly involved in the operations of the ranch beyond the house, offering suggestions for preserving garden produce and helping to organize supplies for the coming cold months. Vaughn valued her practical knowledge, often seeking her opinion on household matters that had previously been left entirely to Mrs. Ortiz. The money she'd saved toward their California journey was growing steadily, tucked away in a tin box beneath her bed. Yet increasingly, Bridget found herself inventing reasons to delay their departure. The children were flourishing. Tommy had begun informal lessons with Mr. Peterson, the former schoolteacher who worked as Vaughn's bookkeeper. Emma had grown rosy-cheeked and round, her previous frailty replaced by exuberant health. And there was Vaughn. Their evening conversations on the porch had become the part of the day Bridget looked forward to most, a quiet interlude when they could speak freely about books they'd read, places they'd seen, or simply sit in companionable silence watching the stars emerge. "Why did you never marry?" Bridget asked one evening, emboldened by the darkness and the strange intimacy that had developed between them. Vaughn was quiet for so long that Bridget feared she had overstepped, but finally he spoke, his voice low. "I was engaged once, a long time ago." "What happened?" Bridget asked gently. "Her name was Catherine. Her father owned the mercantile in Phoenix when I was first starting out," Vaughn explained. "I was working as a ranch hand then, saving every penny. She was everything I thought I wanted, beautiful, educated. She didn't want ranch life," Bridget guessed. "She said she did. We made plans. I bought this land with every cent I'd saved, started building the house." Vaughn paused. Then a lawyer from back east arrived in town, wealthy family, fine clothes, smooth hands. 3 months later, she returned my ring. "I'm sorry," Bridget said, meaning it. Vaughn shrugged, the movement barely visible in the darkness. "It was for the best. She wouldn't have been happy here, and I wouldn't have been happy watching her grow to resent this life." He turned slightly toward Bridget. "What about you? Would you have chosen this life?" The question caught Bridget off guard. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "James and I never discussed ranching. He was a carpenter by trade, a miner by necessity." "And now, what would you choose if choice were truly free?" It was a question Bridget had not allowed herself to consider in years. What would she choose if survival weren't the driving force behind every decision? "Safety," she said finally. "A place where my children could put down roots, where they wouldn't have to wonder where their next meal was coming from or if we'd have a roof over our heads when winter came." She hesitated. A place where they could grow up knowing they were wanted. They have that here, Vaughn said quietly. The words hung between them, laden with meaning Bridget wasn't ready to examine too closely. For now, she agreed, rising from her chair. Good night, Vaughn. Good night, Bridget, he replied, and she could feel his eyes following her as she retreated into the house. That night, sleep eluded her. Vaughn's words echoed in her mind, alongside memories of James's laugh, his dreams, his promises of a better life that death had prevented him from fulfilling. Was it disloyal to consider finding happiness here, in this place, with this man who was so different from her husband, yet equally honorable in his own way? The following week brought an unexpected visitor to the Blackwood ranch. Bridget was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of an approaching buggy. A well-dressed woman, perhaps a few years younger than Bridget herself, stepped down, surveying the ranch house with appraising eyes. "May I help you?" Bridget asked, wiping her hands on her apron. The woman turned, surprise registering on her attractive face. "Oh, I'm looking for Vaughn Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood is checking the north pasture with his men," Bridget replied, noting the familiar use of Vaughn's first name. "He should return by noon. Would you like to wait inside?" "Yes, thank you," the woman said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Victoria Harrington, an old friend of Vaughn's." Bridget introduced herself as the housekeeper, acutely aware of her work dress and wind-blown hair compared to Victoria's immaculate appearance. She showed the visitor to the parlor, offering coffee which Victoria accepted with practiced grace. "How long have you worked for Vaughn?" Victoria asked, her tone conversational but her eyes shrewd. "Just over 2 months," Bridget answered, "and the children I saw playing by the corral." "They're yours," Bridget nodded, a protective instinct rising. "Yes, my son and daughter." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "How progressive of Vaughn to hire a widow with children. He always did have a soft heart beneath that gruff exterior." There was something in the woman's tone, a hint of past intimacy that sent an unexpected pang through Bridget's chest. Before she could respond, the front door opened, and Vaughn's voice called out, "Bridget." Pete said we have a visitor. He stopped in the parlor doorway, his expression changing from open to guarded in an instant. "Victoria, this is unexpected." Victoria rose gracefully. "Hello, Vaughn, it's been a long time." 5 years, he agreed, his tone neutral. "What brings you to Dry Creek?" "Father has business interests in Tucson now. I'm staying with the Merriweathers in town," Victoria explained. "When I heard you were still here, still unmarried." She trailed off meaningfully, an uncomfortable silence fell. Bridget moved toward the door. "I should check on dinner preparations," she murmured. "No need," Vaughn said quickly. "Mrs. Ortiz has it well in hand. In fact, Victoria was just leaving, weren't you?" Victoria's smile tightened slightly. "Actually, I hope we might speak privately, for old time's sake." The look that passed between them confirmed what Bridget had already suspected. Victoria was more than just an acquaintance from Vaughn's past. A strange heaviness settled in her stomach. "I really should see to my duties," Bridget insisted, not meeting Vaughn's eyes as she left the room. For the remainder of the afternoon, Bridget kept herself and the children away from the main house, sending Tommy to help Mr. Peterson in the office and taking Emma to help gather late vegetables from the garden. She told herself it was to give Vaughn privacy with his visitor, but in truth, she couldn't bear to witness their reunion, to see the possibility of her fragile new contentment shattered by this elegant woman from Vaughn's past. It was nearly sunset when Victoria's buggy finally departed. Bridget, watching from the garden, saw Vaughn standing on the porch, his expression unreadable as the vehicle disappeared down the long drive. At dinner, Vaughn was unusually quiet. The children chattered about their day, oblivious to the tension between the adults. It wasn't until after they had gone to bed that Vaughn sought Bridget out on the porch, where she sat mending one of Tommy's shirts by lamplight. "Victoria and I were engaged briefly, years ago," he said without preamble, settling into the chair beside her. Bridget kept her eyes on her stitches. "You don't owe me any explanations, Mr. Blackwood." "I thought we were past Mr. Blackwood," Vaughn said quietly. Bridget looked up then, meeting his gaze. "What happened with Catherine, that was Victoria," Vaughn nodded. "I should have been clearer. I changed her name in the telling. Old habit, I suppose. She's very beautiful, Bridget observed, hating the smallness she heard in her own voice. Yes, Vaughn agreed. And completely wrong for me, which I knew 5 years ago and was reminded of again today. He paused. She wanted me to sell the ranch, move to Tucson. Her father has connections, could set me up in business there. And what did you tell her? Bridget asked, her heart beating faster despite her attempts to remain detached. I told her I already have everything I need right here, Vaughn answered, his eyes never leaving Bridget's face. Almost everything, he amended softly, the implication of his words hung in the air between them. Bridget felt a flush rising to her cheeks, a mixture of confusion and something warmer, more dangerous. Vaughn, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I know you came here with other plans, California, a fresh start, I respect that. He stood, moving to the porch railing, his back to her. But I want you to know that there's a place for you here, for all three of you, not as my housekeeper. As. He trailed off, seemingly unable to put words to what he was offering, or perhaps afraid to, Bridget realized. As what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vaughn turned, the lamplight casting half his face in shadow. As my family, he said simply, if you wanted that. If you could see yourself building a life here with me. The words struck Bridget with the force of a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they represented everything she had stopped allowing herself to hope for after James died. I don't want you to answer now, Vaughn continued hurriedly. I know it's sudden. I know your heart still belongs to your husband in many ways. I'm not asking to replace him, just to stand beside you, to help raise those children and perhaps add to their number someday. To build something lasting together. Tears pricked at Bridget's eyes. Vaughn, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything yet, he replied. Think about it. Talk to the children if you want. Just consider staying, not as an employee, as something more. With that, he nodded once and retreated into the house, leaving Bridget alone with her churning thoughts and the unexpected bloom of hope in her chest. The following days passed in a strange limbo. Vaughn was unfailingly polite but gave Bridget the space she clearly needed to consider his offer. He maintained his usual routines, including their evening conversations on the porch, though these were now punctuated by longer silences and meaningful glances that made Bridget's pulse quicken. She observed him more carefully than ever, the way he patiently taught Tommy to whittle, presenting him with his own small pocket knife. The gentle way he lifted Emma onto her first pony, leading the animal in careful circles while she squealed with delight. The respect with which he treated every person on his ranch, regardless of their position. More than once, she found herself imagining a future here, watching the children grow into adults surrounded by the stability and love of this place, perhaps welcoming new siblings into the family. The thought no longer felt like a betrayal of James's memory, but rather a continuation of the life they had dreamed of together, different in its particulars, but aligned in its essence. One evening in late October, as the first real chill of autumn settled over the ranch, Bridget found Vaughn alone in his study, reviewing ledgers by lamplight. She knocked softly on the open door. "May I speak with you?" she asked. Vaughn set down his pen immediately. "Of course. Please sit." Bridget closed the door behind her, taking the chair across from his desk. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was clear. "I've been thinking about your offer," she began. "And," Vaughn prompted, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see hope flickering in his eyes. "The children love it here," Bridget said. "Tommy talks about nothing but becoming a rancher now. Emma has nightmares about leaving." "And what about their mother?" Vaughn asked quietly. "What does she want?" Bridget took a deep breath. "Their mother has spent 3 years focused solely on survival, on getting through each day with enough food and shelter to keep her children alive. She hasn't allowed herself to want anything beyond that in a very long time." She met his gaze directly. "But recently, she's started to want more." "To hope for more," Vaughn leaned forward slightly. "What does she hope for?" "A partner," Bridget answered honestly. "Someone to share the burden and the joy of raising these children. A home that belongs to her as much as to him, a chance to build something lasting." "I can offer all of that," Vaughn said, his voice rough with emotion. "And more, Bridget, I can offer you my heart if you're willing to take it." "I think," Bridget said carefully, "that I may have already taken it without meaning to, and perhaps left my own in exchange." Vaughn rose from his chair, moving around the desk to kneel beside her, taking her hands in his. "Is that a yes? You'll stay? You'll become my wife?" Bridget looked down at their joined hands, her slim fingers, calloused from years of work, enveloped in his larger, stronger ones. How strange life was, that the journey she had begun in desperation, feeding her children scraps in a stranger's barn, had led her here to this moment, to this man. "Yes," she said, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. "We'll stay, all of us." Vaughn's answering smile was radiant. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle kiss, full of promise and the certainty of tomorrow. Their wedding took place on Christmas Eve, 1883, in the Blackwood ranch house, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. Reverend Michaels came from Dry Creek to perform the ceremony, and the entire ranch turned out to celebrate. Emma served as flower girl, scattering dried rose petals Mrs. Ortiz had saved specially for the occasion, while Tommy stood proudly as Vaughn's best man, chest puffed out in his new suit. Bridget wore a simple dress of deep blue silk, Vaughn's wedding gift, ordered all the way from Phoenix. As she spoke her vows, she felt James's memory as a gentle presence, not a shadow, a blessing on this new chapter rather than a ghost haunting it. "You look beautiful," Vaughn whispered as they turned to face their guests as husband and wife for the first time. "You look happy," Bridget replied, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I am happy," he confirmed, "for the first time in a very long time." That night, after the celebrations had ended and the children were asleep in their rooms, no longer in the quarters above the kitchen, but in proper bedrooms in the family wing of the house, Bridget and Vaughn stood together on the porch, looking out at the land that was now truly their shared home. "I never expected to find you," Vaughn said, his arm around her waist. "I'd resigned myself to building this ranch for no one but myself, and I never expected to find safety again," Bridget replied, "let alone love. We found each other," Vaughn said simply. "And that's the beginning of our story, not the end." Spring arrived at the Blackwood Ranch with a riot of wildflowers and the news that the family would be expanding. Bridget's announcement at breakfast was met with whoops of joy from Vaughn, excited questions from Emma, and a thoughtful nod from Tommy, who had appointed himself the family protector and took the responsibility of big brotherhood very seriously. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Emma demanded, bouncing in her seat. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Bridget explained, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Around harvest time, the doctor thinks." "A harvest baby," Vaughn said, his voice filled with wonder as he reached across the table to cover her hand with his own. Perfect timing. As Bridget's body changed with the growing child, so too did the ranch. Vaughn added a nursery adjoining their bedroom, Tommy helped paint it a cheerful yellow, and Emma insisted on collecting special rocks and feathers to decorate the windowsill, so the baby knows about outside things right away. Mrs. Ortiz knitted blankets and tiny garments, sharing superstitions and wisdom from her own experience as a mother. The ranch hands, many of whom had families of their own in town, brought small gifts: a hand-carved wooden horse, a tiny pair of leather moccasins, a silver rattle that had belonged to one man's grandmother. In the evenings, when the children were asleep, Vaughn would talk softly to Bridget's growing belly, telling the baby about the ranch, the horses, the land that would one day be his or hers to love as they did. "I never thought I'd have this," Vaughn confessed one night as they lay together, his hand spanning Bridget's rounded stomach where their child kicked vigorously. "A true family, someone to build for, to plan for." "I never thought I'd have a second chance," Bridget replied, covering his hand with her own. "But here we are, Vaughn agreed, kissing her tenderly, "and here we'll stay." In October 1884, almost exactly a year after Bridget had agreed to become Vaughn's wife, their son was born, James Vaughn Blackwood, named for the father he would never know and the father who had chosen him as his own. He had Vaughn's blue eyes and Bridget's determined chin, and from his first lusty cry, it was clear he had the strong will of both his parents. Tommy and Emma were enchanted with their baby brother, arguing good-naturedly over whose turn it was to hold him or help with his care. Vaughn proved to be a natural father, as comfortable cradling the infant against his broad chest as he was breaking wild horses or negotiating cattle prices. Watching him rock little James to sleep one evening, singing a low, off-key lullaby he remembered from his own childhood, Bridget felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Vaughn asked, noticing her emotion. "I was just thinking about that night in the barn," Bridget explained. "How desperate I was, how afraid, if you hadn't found us there." "But I did find you," Vaughn reminded her gently, "and you found me, though I didn't know I was lost until you showed up." He looked down at their sleeping son. "Everything that led us to that moment, all the hardship, all the struggle, it was worth it, wasn't it, to end up here?" "Yes," Bridget agreed, crossing the room to join her husband and son, feeling the solid strength of Vaughn's arm as it circled her waist. "It was all worth it for this." Outside, the sun set over the Blackwood ranch, casting long shadows across the land that had once seemed so foreign to Bridget, but now felt more like home than anywhere she had ever been. In the distance, Tommy and Emma's laughter rang out as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, their voices free from the worry that had once been their constant companion. Inside, in the warm circle of her husband's embrace, with their newborn son sleeping peacefully between them, Bridget Mason Blackwood knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just shelter but belonging. Not just survival, but life in all its fullness. And it had all begun with a hungry night, a desperate mother, and a cowboy who couldn't bear to see children fed on scraps in his house. Not then, not ever again.